The fluorescent lights in the Detroit courthouse hummed with an electric persistence that reminded Marcus Thompson of the generators back in Kandahar. He shifted uncomfortably in the wooden chair, his prosthetic leg creating a subtle clicking sound against the floor that seemed to echo through the sterile courtroom. The smell of old coffee and industrial disinfectant hung in the air, mixing with the nervous sweat of too many people crammed into too small a space. Marcus rubbed his calloused hands together, feeling the rough texture of scars that mapped out 3 tours of duty across his palms. At 32, he carried himself with the disciplined posture of a soldier, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much. The public defender assigned to his case, a harried woman named Jennifer Martinez, shuffled through papers beside him with the mechanical efficiency of someone managing an impossible caseload. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the packed courtroom. "Remember what we discussed? The prosecution's case is largely circumstantial. We just need to establish reasonable doubt." Marcus nodded, but his attention drifted to the faces in the gallery behind him. Most were strangers, drawn by the local news coverage of a veteran accused of assault outside a downtown bar. The incident had happened 3 weeks ago, during one of those humid Detroit summer nights when the city's tensions seemed to simmer just below the surface. Marcus remembered fragments, raised voices, someone shoving him, the instinctive reaction that had been drilled into him during years of combat training. What he couldn't remember was throwing the first punch. The alleged victim, a college student named Derek Sullivan, sat in the front row with his parents. A bandage still covered part of his left temple, and his mother occasionally reached over to touch his arm protectively. Marcus felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten. He had never wanted to hurt anyone, especially not some kid who probably had his whole life ahead of him. Judge Patricia Hawkins entered the courtroom with the authority of someone who had presided over thousands of cases. Her graying hair was pulled back severely, and her sharp eyes surveyed the room with practiced efficiency. Marcus had researched her before the trial, 15 years on the bench, known for her no-nonsense approach and particularly harsh sentences for violent crimes. "All rise," called the bailiff, and the courtroom rose as one. As they settled back into their seats, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement near the back of the courtroom. For a moment, he thought he recognized a familiar silhouette, but the figure had already disappeared behind the crowd. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he realized that in a few hours, his fate would be decided by 12 strangers, who knew nothing about the nightmares that still woke him at 3 a.m., or the way loud noises made him instinctively reach for weapons that weren't there anymore. The prosecution painted Marcus as a ticking time bomb, a troubled veteran whose military training had turned him into a weapon that couldn't be safely returned to civilian society. District Attorney Robert Steinberg was a seasoned prosecutor with silver hair and a voice that commanded attention. He paced in front of the jury box like a predator circling prey. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steinberg's voice filled the courtroom, "the evidence will show that Miss Thompson struck Derek's force that it fractured brittle bone and left him outside Murphy's Tavern. Mr. Sullivan was simply trying to help when with the bar's tab." Marcus watched the Steinberg. The prosecutor was skilled, weaving a narrative that transformed Marcus from victim to villain. Security footage from the bar showed Marcus visibly agitated, gesturing emphatically during what appeared to be a heated conversation with the bartender. The video cut off just before the incident outside. When Derek Sullivan took the stand, his testimony was clear and damaging. "I just wanted to help," he said, his voice steady despite the obvious nervousness. "I could see the bartender was uncomfortable, and when I stepped outside for air, I saw Mr. Thompson following me. He seemed really angry. I asked if he was okay, and that's when he just exploded. I didn't even have time to react." Marcus's defense felt thin in comparison. Jennifer Martinez did her best, highlighting inconsistencies in witness statements and questioning the lighting conditions outside the bar. She emphasized Marcus's military service and the challenges of veteran reintegration, but Marcus could see the jury wasn't buying it. The prosecutor's cross-examination of the character witnesses felt like a systematic dismantling of any sympathy Marcus might have generated. The turning point came when the prosecution introduced evidence of Marcus's previous arrest for disorderly conduct 6 months earlier, a bar fight that had been dismissed when the other party failed to appear in court. Judge Hawkins allowed it over Martinez's objections, ruling it relevant to establishing a pattern of behavior. As the trial progressed over 2 days, Marcus felt the walls closing in. The prosecutor's closing argument was devastating, portraying him as an unstable veteran who posed a danger to the community. "Military service is honorable," Steinberg concluded, "but it doesn't give anyone the right to bring the battlefield home to our streets." When the jury returned after just 4 hours of deliberation, Marcus knew the verdict before the foreman spoke. Guilty on charges of aggravated assault. The gasps from the gallery seemed to come from very far away. Judge Hawkins scheduled sentencing for the following week, and Marcus was remanded to county jail pending the hearing. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, and Marcus felt something inside him break. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, he caught sight of that familiar figure again. A tall man in a crisp dress uniform standing near the back exit. This time, Marcus was certain he recognized the face, but before he could focus clearly, the man was gone. Colonel James Patterson read the news article 3 times before setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care. The headline screamed across the Detroit Free Press, "Veteran sentenced to 3 years for downtown assault." But it was the photo that stopped him cold. Marcus Thompson in handcuffs, his face a mask of resignation and defeat. Patterson had spent the last week tracking down the story after catching a brief mention on the military news network. What he found didn't match the soldier he remembered. Marcus had served under his command during the most dangerous months of his final deployment in Afghanistan. Patterson remembered him as level-headed, protective of his squad, the kind of soldier who would risk his own life to carry a wounded comrade to safety. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for that afternoon. Patterson had driven 6 hours from Fort Campbell, still wearing his dress uniform from a morning ceremony. He had called the courthouse, identified himself to the clerk, and requested permission to speak as a character witness. The response had been less than encouraging. The defense attorney seemed harried and unfamiliar with military protocol. Patterson arrived at the courthouse to find a media circus. Local news vans lined the street and reporters clustered around the steps like hungry vultures. Inside, the courtroom was packed again, the same mixture of curiosity seekers and victims' families. He found a seat in the back and watched as Marcus was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller and more vulnerable than Patterson remembered. Judge Hawkins was in the middle of reviewing the case when Patterson stood up. "Your Honor," his voice cut through the murmur of the courtroom with military precision, "I request permission to address the court regarding the character of the defendant." The judge looked up, clearly surprised by the interruption. "And you are?" "Colonel James Patterson, United States Army. I was Mr. Thompson's commanding officer in Afghanistan." Jennifer Martinez looked stunned. She quickly approached the bench for a whispered conference with the judge and prosecutor. Marcus turned in his chair, his eyes wide with recognition and something that might have been hope. After several minutes of heated discussion, Judge Hawkins addressed the courtroom. "Colonel Patterson, while highly irregular, I'll allow you to speak. However, this court has already heard character testimony during the trial phase." Patterson approached the witness stand with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. As he was sworn in, Marcus felt a flutter of something he hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that someone might actually understand who he really was beneath the label of troubled veteran. Colonel Patterson's testimony began quietly, methodically, like a military briefing. But as he spoke, his voice gained strength and conviction that filled the courtroom. "Your Honor, I commanded Alpha Company's 2nd Battalion during 18 months of combat operations in Kandahar Province. Sergeant Thompson served under me for the final 8 months of that deployment, and I can say without reservation that he saved more lives than most people will touch in their entire existence." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing to listen. On March 15th, 2019, our convoy was ambushed in a kill zone. An IED disabled our lead vehicle, and we were taking fire from 3 directions. Sergeant Thompson was in the second vehicle when he saw that our medic was pinned down trying to reach 2 wounded soldiers. Without orders, without backup, he dismounted his vehicle and crossed 50 meters of open ground under heavy fire to create a diversion. Patterson's eyes found Marcus in the defendant's chair. "He drew fire deliberately, Your Honor, took a bullet in the shoulder and kept fighting until our air support arrived. Those 2 soldiers went home to their families because Marcus Thompson decided their lives were worth more than his own safety." The prosecutor started to object, but Judge Hawkins held up her hand. Patterson continued, his voice steady but passionate. "What I'm describing isn't just courage, Your Honor. It's the kind of split-second decision-making that requires absolute clarity of judgment under extreme stress. This is not a man who loses control randomly. This is not a man who hurts innocent people." He pulled a folder from his jacket. "I've brought the incident reports from that deployment, along with witness statements from other soldiers who served with Sergeant Thompson. But more importantly, I need this court to understand the context of his transition home. Patterson's voice softened slightly. When Marcus left the military, he wasn't just leaving a job. He was leaving a support system, a sense of purpose, and a group of people who understood the weight he carries every day. The Department of Veterans Affairs failed him. The civilian job market failed him, but this court has an opportunity not to fail him. The colonel turned to address the gallery, his voice growing stronger. I've read the testimony from the previous trial. I've reviewed the security footage. What I see is a man struggling with invisible wounds, trying to navigate a civilian world that doesn't understand the hypervigilance and startled responses that kept him alive for 3 tours of duty. Judge Hawkins leaned forward. Colonel, are you suggesting that military service excuses assault? No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting that context matters. And I'm suggesting that Marcus Thompson's character speaks to who he really is, not who he might have appeared to be during the worst moment of his civilian transition. Patterson opened the folder and began reading names. Private First Class Jennifer Martinez, saved when Thompson carried her unconscious body 2 miles through hostile territory. Staff Sergeant David Kim, alive today because Thompson spotted an IED wire that others missed. Corporal Michael Stevens, rescued from a burning vehicle by Thompson, who suffered second-degree burns on his hands and arms. With each name, Marcus felt tears he had been holding back for months begin to fall. In the gallery, he could see some of the jurors from his trial watching with different expressions than they had worn during the verdict. Colonel Patterson set down the folder and faced Judge Hawkins directly. Your Honor, I've served 30 years in the United States Army. I've commanded soldiers in 3 different wars. I can count on one hand the number of people I would trust with my life without question. Marcus Thompson is one of them. The courtroom remained silent as Patterson returned to his seat. Judge Hawkins took several minutes to review the documents he had provided, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Thompson, please stand. Marcus rose on unsteady legs, his public defender beside him. Having reviewed the additional testimony and supporting documentation provided by Colonel Patterson, this court finds that the original proceedings may not have fully considered the complexity of your circumstances. While this court cannot overturn a jury verdict, I am hereby reducing your sentence to time served, plus 2 years of supervised probation with mandatory counseling through the Veterans Affairs PTSD program. The gavel fell again, but this time the carried hope instead of finality. As Marcus was processed for release, Colonel Patterson waited in the corridor outside. Sir, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know how to thank you. Patterson placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. You thank me by getting help, soldier. You thank me by remembering that coming home isn't the end of your service. It's just a different kind of mission. But for Marcus Thompson, the real work of finally begin.